this tutorial, you're going to learn how to use the HTTP module inside of make.com and specifically how to make an OAuth 2.0 request, because you see that there are multiple different actions available. You can get a file, you can make a basic auth request, you can make a request, but then there is also this make an OAuth 2.0 request. And I'm going to show you how that works in this video. By the way, if you don't know what the HTTP module is, what an API is, what JSON files are, then you should definitely check out the entire series. This is a 6-parter. And we're in part 5, so you should check out the other videos if you are lost at any point of this video. So let's get started. The first thing that we're going to do is we're just going to select this make an OAuth 2 request. So I have this webhook, I'm going to click plus, then I select the HTTP module here and specifically make an OAuth 2.0 request. So when you have that, you see that you can select different actions there up here. If you don't have any actions available there, you will need to click on this add button, and then you can click the authorize URI, token URI, client ID and client secret in order to authenticate yourself for API services that have a authentication server associated with them. So let's look at what all of these things mean before we go deeper into the practice part. So I prepared a little presentation here. So let's look at what OAuth 2 is. OAuth 2 is a secure API access protocol or framework. So this framework allows third-party applications to access resources on behalf of a user without sharing their credentials, so without sharing their login information. So some key components that we need to look at are the client ID and the secret, which are unique identifiers for the app requesting access. So let's say our make.com app, our scenario, is trying to access an API. We need to have a client ID and a secret which are specific to our make.com application. Then there is this thing called access token, which is a temporary key to access resources. So when you are logged into the server, you get the access token, and this token is just a very, very long string or a bunch of characters, so to speak. And those are this token has all the details about you having access to a certain piece of a server. So this is specifically important and relevant when you have a user account, you are logged in, and inside of your user account, you have all of the different data stored about you. Or let's say if you want to access some social media tools or whatever, you cannot just do that with an API key. You actually need to be authenticated. Once you authenticate yourself, you get a token. So this access token, which is stored inside of your cookies. And yeah, basically then whenever you access this website, you will see that you are logged in automatically, for example. And the same thing technically happens here. So whenever you are cleaning your cookies, deleting all your cookies in the browser, and you try to access a website, you see that you will need to log in again because the access token is not stored in your cookies anymore, and you need to log in again in order to issue a new access token. So then there is this thing called an authorization server, which verifies user identity and issues the token. So this authorization server is often, it's mainly separated from the resource server. So it's not the same computer, so to speak, somewhere. It's not the same server. It's two different servers. One is taking care of only the authentication or authorization, and the other one has all the details, such as all of your personal details that you have in a database, for example, or any other relevant information that are stored inside of an API server, or that the API offers you, so to speak. And then we have the resource server, and that is the system where protected data or services reside. Okay, so this is only relevant for data that is protected. If we look at the example that we built in the last video where we used Spoonacular, all of this information is not protect-worthy or protection-worthy. Okay, so whether a meal that is a pasta meal or whatever, it's not really protection-worthy. But if it's something that has to do, let's say, with your health information or like your health insurance or insurance information or whatever, all of that information should not be easily accessible through an API key. It should be something that you need to be authenticated in order to get the information. Okay, so that's how it looks like. You are the client, in our case, our Make application, and it accesses the authorization server and tries to authenticate. Okay, so it tries to say, hey, I am the application that has the access rights to certain information. And then the authorization server goes to the application. And finally, the application then gets access to the resource server and loads all of the relevant information to display in the application. And in our API specific case, the application will then send data back to our client, so to our Make application, where we can then use the information in our automation. Okay, so coming back here, let's set up a connection using the authorization URI and token URI. Therefore, I have selected this particular example here, which is deviantart.com. You can see that here, deviantart.com/developers. There you find the details. And it explains here that there are 3 ways for applications and websites to integrate with DeviantArt. So I'm just using this example because it's just available and we can use it for testing, which is great. So there are 3 different APIs. So OEmbed MPI, RSS API, and then the DeviantArt-API. So here you see getting started with OAuth 2.0. That's the keyword that we were talking about earlier. So to use our OAuth API, first you need to have a DeviantArt account, and then you need to log in to register a new developer application. And once that is done, you will be given a client ID and secret ID. And if you look back here, you see here, we need a client ID and a secret ID. Okay, so let's set those things up. Therefore, we need to register an application and we need to log in. So once you are logged in, you can register an application. All right, once you're here, you need to register your application. So I'm going to call this one AI Dennis Tutorial, HTTP or something like that. You can add a description, you can leave it out. Then you have 2 options for the OAuth2 grant type. The implicit one, which would hold the token somehow in the communication. So the more secure way is the authorization code option. Then you need to whitelist some websites. So for example, in my case, I want to use make.com to, well, with this particular API. So I need to whitelist Integromat. So there is this thing, if you just Google for it, you will find that, well, you just need to Google for Integromat OAuth2 URL, and you will find this URL here. So this is the URL that you need to copy, and you need to put it inside of your DeviantArt whitelisting down here. And the original URL whitelist, that's where you also need to add Integromat. Okay, so here add URL whitelist, this integromat.com URL. Whitelisting basically just means that you are allowing API calls that come from this website. So in our particular case, we are using make.com. So this is our application, right? We're trying to access with our application, we're trying to access this API. And in order to make it securer so that this API call cannot come from any other website or any other person, but only come from make.com calls, that's why we are whitelisting it. The opposite of whitelisting is blacklisting. So blacklisting just makes sure that, for example, somebody where an API call coming from a certain server would not be accepted at all. So it would be declined instantly. And whitelisting is just the other way around, where you just say no other websites can access the API call or no other services except for this particular one. We're adding it to our whitelist. And then if you scroll further down, we're going to disable comments, because otherwise you would get notifications whenever there is a new entry inside of your application. So somebody makes a comment to your application or whatever, then you would get notified. So let's just disable it from the start so that we don't get bothered. All right. So as I said, again, we're using DeviantArt because it's just an easy and cheap way to get to know OAuth2. You don't have to use this one. You can use it with other tools as well, but this is just going to be easier to follow along. Okay, so then we can save our application. All right, now that we have that, going back to the developers page, when we are logged in, we will see our application. So our published application here, this AI Dennis Tutorial HTTP, then we have the client ID. I can take that, I can go back to Make, I can put that in here as the client ID, and then I can copy this secret here, and I can also go over to Make and add it as the client secret. So what I'm missing now is the authorized URI and the token URI. So where do I get those from? Therefore, you can go over to the authentication part on the website. So here you go to authentication, and there you will find, well, the whole explanation as to what that does and how it works. So here we have the user authorization and the getting a user access token. So I'm going to copy this authorization. This is the authorized URI. So URI is like the URL. And then we need to do the same thing with the token. So we paste that in here. And at that point, we should be ready to go. Once we click OK, we need to authorize make.com inside of our DeviantArt tool. Okay. And once we did that, we should have a connection. So there we are. Now I have this my HTTP to OAuth connection. I didn't give it a proper name. You can go over to your connections here and rename it accordingly. But now we can go and set up the URL to actually do an HTTP request to the API that we want to use, in this case to DeviantArt. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to actually get the URL that we want to use. So you see here DeviantArt and stash. There you can select different types of endpoints. So here daily deviations, deviations you watch, home, and so forth. All right. So let's say I want to browse daily deviations. This is going to be the URL. So the endpoint that I want to use. So it's a get response or get request. So here the method is set to get. This is the URL that I just looked at. So this will now give me the daily deviations. All right. So at this point we can try it out, but we should run into a problem. And that is something that is specific to DeviantArt, but let's just run it with our webhook that we had earlier. And well, we get data, but it says insufficient scope. So we get a response, so to speak, no error in make.com, but we get a status code for OAuth2, well, which is just an error code, okay? And we're going to jump into error or status codes in the next video, but before we do that, let's actually fix this problem. Therefore, I'm going to go over to connections and I'm going to modify this particular connection that I just made. But before I do that, let's actually make sure that we save this. So this is HTTP OAuth tutorial. Okay, let's save it so that we don't lose it. Then go over to connections and select the connection that you just made. And here under connections, you will find this my OAuth connection. I'm going to edit that connection because I didn't add a scope. So we need to add a scope here. Otherwise, there is this error that we just saw and we don't get the details. So that is something that isn't really well explained in the DeviantArt from what I can tell. So here are some examples, the access token, but nothing really about the scope. So what we can do is we can just add this browse scope in here. Okay. So I'm going to say browse in here. And let me check if I wrote it correctly. Yeah, there we are. So I'm going to leave everything else as is. I'm going to save and I will need to authorize the application once again. So click on authorize. And once we're done with that, let's jump back to our scenario that we built, this HTTP OAuth tutorial. And let's run this once again. So wait for new data, run the webhook. And now this time we get some results. So we get a bunch nicer outputs. Now we can also make it, well, we can parse it so that we get a better, more relevant output or more readable output. So let's jump into that. Let's look at the data results and we see we get 12 results. So these are the arts of the day. So this is, for example, 1. So I can go to this URL and this is the year of trees. This is one of the DeviantArt items that was created for us. Or here, the next output is sunflower, I guess. So let's go over here. There we are. So it's not really about the application itself. It's really just about this authentication. And that was the goal of this video. And I believe we achieved that. We saw how we can set up this authentication. By the way, about this little connection change that I made, and let's go back. Let's save the changes. Let's go back to this connection change. So now how would you know about this scope that you need to set it to browse? How would you know about that when you are setting up your OAuth connection? Well, that's the thing. You would have that either in the documentation, specifically explaining you how that works, or you would just try it without this scope. You would get an error. You would search for the error like you use ChatGPT, for example, to tell you how you can fix that error, and then you just follow the instructions and you should find a solution. But that is a specific situation that you have for the DeviantArt authentication. In other like OAuth2 authentications, you wouldn't need the scope necessarily. Okay, so this really highly depends on the connection that you want to make or the OAuth connection that you want to use. Okay, the API. So some APIs have that, some don't need that. So that's something that you need to be aware of. In case you wondered where I got this browse from, well, you can see that here where it says scope browse. Okay, so this is the error. Well, I went back to the history of our iterations and I went to the details here, and then I can see the output that I've gotten. And the output from this make.com request here, this OAuth2 request, was that it says insufficient scope, and I needed to set the scope to browse. And that's how I did it. Okay, just so you were aware. All right, that's it for this video. By the way, if you haven't joined my AI automation specialist yet, where you're going to learn a lot more about AI automation, about make.com and how to use Airtable most efficiently to build amazing automations, then you should definitely join now. You should definitely check it out. There are a bunch of really amazing templates as well here that are business focused and that you can sell to businesses and make you a decent living out of it. So, or start your own business even. So that's that for now, and see you in the next video where we're going to look at the response codes.